All right, hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the first data-related discussion of the spring 2021 semester. We just wanted to kick off this cycle with making sure that everyone had a clear understanding of how to yield the best matches for your rosters moving forward. So we're excited to have a member of our REPS team, the Research Evaluation and Program Support, who is in charge of matching your students for us for the data share process. And so for today's agenda, for the first half of the day, we will have the presentation from our REPS team. And then afterwards, we'll go over some of the anti-racism training updates, as well as our Student Advisory Council. So we're going to have this presentation for about 15 to 20 minutes. There will be about 10 minutes for a Q&A. And then for the organizations who have showed interest in doing some troubleshooting, we will provide some breakouts later in the day. So again, there is a Google Doc that I shared that you all can use to include any questions, and that way we can just make sure that those answers are made available for you following this event. So I will like to now introduce our facilitator for this early morning, Varunda. She is from the Office of Research Evaluation and Program Support. So I'll throw it over to you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So as Latifa mentioned, I'm Varunda Cholia. I'm a senior research analyst at the Office of Research Evaluation and Program Support. I've been working on this program over 3 years. I'm very familiar with the match process. I'm hoping to kind of walk through how we kind of what's our match process like, and I want to make sure that it's you guys understand how we do the match process, but at the same time there will be a 1 or 2 polls where I'm curious about how you work with your data, what are some challenges that you face, and then we'll jump back to like what are currently the main barriers or challenges that kind of prohibit us from getting us the best match. So and then you are not able to also like match your students against CUNY First. And then the last section is like best practices for data entry and management. And I, from the start, I'll say that these are like very basic recommendations that we already always know, but it's just more like a refresher to make sure that if we follow this, this will definitely help in enhancing our match. So the purpose of today's meeting is really just to understand how we match. And if I could just explain our entire process in a nutshell, we can think of our process as like data collection and submission. This section is primarily where all the data gets collected. So each CBO submits the roster, and K16 here, Latiqua and Rebecca consolidate it. And a lot of our focus, the later part of our presentation, will really focus on how can we better improve this section so we can obtain more valid matches when REPS starts working on it. So after the data collection, a lot of what we do is really data verification and pulling CUNY First data. The first stage is really cleaning data, making sure all the data is correctly formatted, because that matters. If it's not in the right format, records get dropped or records are not matched. Dealing with duplicates. So a same student shows up multiple times, but each of those students have different information. And how do we kind of determine, is it the same student or not? Should we keep them? Should we keep one record or all of those records? There's a lot of decision making that we have to do on our end. So dealing with duplicates. And our end goal is to make sure that we keep one record for every student that was served in a given semester. After which, we go through the match process. And this is where we submit all of the data, all biographical data of a student, and we try to obtain or validate a given MPL ID. And so far across, like in the 3 years, what we've noticed is that we match about 50 plus or minus 10% of the students who get submitted in the rosters. So there's a lot of students who remain unmatched. One could be that they are not in CUNY. 2, they are, but we don't have enough information that we are able to match them to a valid MPL ID. Once we get an MPL ID or once we have a list of validated MPL IDs, we use those MPL IDs to then tap into the CUNY-1st system and pull enrollment records and start flagging if they're enrolled in the current semester. And then after that, we simply merge the cleaned CUNY data back to the original roster. So we connect all the students back to the CBO and send it back. So a lot of the recommendations are going to be focused on how can we improve the data collection here so we can have an easier time to deal with duplicates and also obtain more valid matches. So one of the questions I think I always ask Rebecca and Latiqua is, how do you all connect the student data? So Latiqua will do a quick poll. I'm curious, at what point does it get entered as into a system? Do you collect it through paper and then enter it? Is it directly? And the reason why we're collecting this is it'll really help us think about how we should maybe set up the roster, what additional verifications we should embed so we can deal with the issues earlier on. And I'll keep moving along so that we can finish within our 20-minute mark. So our reps matching process. So in the next couple of slides, we're just going to explain how we work through this. So the first thing is for the reps matching process, what we require is 3 required fields. We must have a student's first name, last name, and date of birth. And that is critical to identify a student in any data system. So our office matches students not just to CUNY-1st data, so not just trying to identify if they exist in the CUNY system. We do it for all data sources that we use. We also try to match students if they exist in the DOE system. So this is the same process we use for any data source. So, and the most critical data points that we need for a match is a student's name and date of birth. What else can increase the probability of a match is if we have, if you have OSIS ID, even if we don't use it, we definitely merge it with the DOE data to capture any additional information that we can on that student, even if they graduated a couple years ago. I feel like there's more information is better than no information. Having an MPL ID definitely helps because it's easier to check if the MPL ID exists and it belongs to that student than not having an MPL ID. And address, phone number, and email are any bonus points. If you have it, we will take it and we will try to match on that. These additional data points are very helpful when we have to deal with duplicates of a student. If we have someone like Sarah James with 2 different date of births, having address, phone number, and email will be helpful in trying to distinguish whether those are 2 different Sarah James or are they the same student, for example. So these additional informations are critical for that. So how does a matching work? I'm going to keep it very simple. It's essentially just a scoring system. So we collect these data points, and we're simply trying to match against the CUNY data. And if we see that, for example, if MPL ID matches to the MPL ID in our CUNY system, we just do a score of 1 or 0. If they match, it's 1. If they don't match, it's 0. And we go through, we say, okay, does the first name match? Yes, 1 or 0. And we go through the entire list until we finish everything. We go through and match all of those 7 to 8 different variables. And then we get a total possible score of 7. So every time you match, every record is assigned a score. The higher the score, the better the match. The more confident we are that this is the right student. And we can say that this is the student you served, here's their MPL ID and their enrollment record. The lower the match, we become very unsure. And as an office, having gone through these matching process, we've started to establish thresholds for what we consider as a good match. At the end of the day, it's a level of confidence. How confident are we that this is the student that you served? So for our office, we have different thresholds depending on the match type. If we match on an ID, that means you've provided us with an MPL ID and they have a score of 2. That means not only did the ID match, 2 additional data points matched here. And the 2 is probably going to be first name and last name. We are going to accept that as a valid match. Not only is there an ID, but they match the same student name. A name match has to have a higher score because, again, Sarah James could be a very common name. So you need one additional data point that should match. And typically that's going to be date of birth or something else. But the threshold for our scores start to increase as you start to rely on things like date of birth and phone match. Many people are born on the same day. So we can't just say that if there's someone's born on the same day that you can accept every record. So for name, date of birth match and phone numbers, we start to put a higher threshold to determine which student is an official match. While this may sound kind of abstract right now, I have a couple of examples that could clear it out. So, for example, if we received 100 records of CBO participants, when we submit the match, we get back almost like twice or thrice the size of a result. We get back 325 potential matches because they think, because they try to match on all of these combinations. So if just first name matches for a student, that is considered a potential match. So let's follow a student called, let's say, Janisha Williams. She happens to be a participant in this network and we submit a match. What gets returned to us are 3 different options. The first option is the temp, anything that says temp is coming from the roster, and anything that says master is coming from our official CUNY data source. So we basically check, oh, does the last name match? Obviously, this is not manually done, but I'm going through one example. We check, okay, last name matches. First name matches, date of birth matches, and another data point probably matched. I've just cropped out the most important variables. So we have an ID match of a score 4. We consider that to be a true match and we capture their ID. But we also get other potential matches where only their last name matches, but the first name don't, but Jane is close enough to Janisha. So it's thinking this is a half match and date of birth doesn't match, but it's still giving us a score of 1. And you have to say that this is not a right student. And the third one is even more strange because pretty much nothing matches except the birthday. They were born on the same day and that's it. But it still gives you a match, but something else probably matched, such as phone number. They might have at some point shared a number because numbers gets exchanged these days. So both of those are considered invalid matches. So this is how a matching works on our end. So the more information we have, the higher the score, and we have certain thresholds. So what do we need for a match? Now that you understand how matching works, what do we need? How do we start when we get a roster? The first thing we have to do is to make sure that we compile a official roster for a given semester. So we want to capture every record of a student that was served at any CBO, and that we store it as a master list for that semester. And then in order to start a match, we need to only submit unique students served in a given semester, regardless of whether they were, if a single student was served by 2 CBOs or not, we can only submit a student level roster. So our goal is to keep one observation. We can only keep one record of a student. And quite often, we notice that, within a single CBO, the same student is submitted multiple times with different levels of information. So a lot of our task is trying to consolidate that data into a single record. When it's within a single CBO, it gets hard because we don't know which one is the most updated information. But what's nice about this is that when the same student is served across multiple CBOs, we get to use the strength of the network to consolidate data so we can actually try to get you a valid FLID match. So I'm just going to put all the challenges we face on data cleaning in one slide, and then I'm going to walk you through 3 examples. A lot of our challenges is really inconsistencies in student data. Having multiple student entries across multiple CBOs, this is something that occurs during the roster consolidation process at K16. So we're talking about that separately internally. But the other component is, what do we do when we have multiple entries within a single CBO submission? Typically what happens is different counselors are serving these students and each counselor is submitting a record. How can we how can you submit only the latest record of the student with the most up-to-date information? Can counselors update the existing record? Or new information is available. So student A gets submitted once without a date of birth, and then they get submitted twice the second time, and then date of birth gets updated. How can we start updating the existing record, or how can we start differentiating that the latest how do you as a CBO submit only the latest data point for that student? We have multiple MPL IDs. Are these two different students, or perhaps they're twins? Sometimes that's a possibility. Dates are sometimes formatted differently. There are typos, or nicknames are provided for the students. So it's not their official legal name. And that could be a possibility of a duplicate. Or something that has occurred once or twice is switching of columns. Sometimes first names and last names get switched, and we think none of these students end up matching. But for the last iteration, we edited our algorithm so we can capture this. So even if it's switched, we did a match by switching the columns. What all of this does is that it increases the data cleaning time. And also sometimes we don't have enough information on how to deal with the students. Which records should we actually submit for the match? Or how should we consolidate this? So we can't make these decisions on our end. So it'll be helpful if we could think about how we can submit cleaner rosters. So, or especially dealing with duplicates. I believe that you have more information on your end to flag the correct record and submit that. So just a quick, simple example. So imagine this situation. Let's think of like if we were God and we knew the actual reality, which was the same student was served at two different CBOs, CBO A and CBO B. They were served by two different counselors. In the first CBO, the name was given, it's Alexa Jimenez, born in 2004 with the following MPL ID. In CBO U, Alex Jimenez was served, same date of birth, MPL ID is the same, the only difference is a small typo between 45 and 54. As manually looking, I'd say, okay, you know what? This is too close, so it could be just a possibility of a typo. Either the A got missed as a typo, or she goes by Alex. She doesn't want to say her full name. But manually, it's possible to check this. When you are dealing with thousands of students and you're just trying to identify if these records are unique, we're not going to be able to pick this up. So we will treat them as two different students. But in the data cleaning section, even though we treat them as two different students, when the match comes back, it'll come back with the correct MPL ID. So it's a very easy situation we can rectify. Because it matches to the same MPL ID, we will provide the corrected data back to the CBO. Oh. I think, one second. I think my remote desktop just disappeared. Give me one. We're back. So this is a very simple situation. What do we do if, when things get a bit more complex? For example, there are some students, for example, you have multiple records across CBOs and within CBOs. If it's just across CBOs, we will, even if they have different information, we will automatically treat these as different students. The issue is when these exist within the same CBO. The questions that we have is, it could be a popular ethnic name, but it could be the same student, but we won't be able to determine if it's truly a different student or who's giving us different date of births, or is it the same? So this is a very clear example of where more information is meaningful. Having address, phone number, email will help us determine whether Diallo, Mamadou are three distinct students who happen to have the same name, or are they the same student who are somehow just giving different date of birth. So I would when I'm manually looking at it, I would say the fourth and fifth record is probably the same student because they're using the same month and year, and they're just kind of playing around with the dates. But this is a lot of details that we cannot look at student by student. The only time we start to look at student by student is we notice, 5 students are not matching. We can manually go in and check, and we will update the things. But if it goes beyond 10, it gets harder. So I keep mentioning duplicates, and I wanted to make sure that like I identify what type of duplicates, because duplicates work in our favor when one CBO provides a data, for example, here, we're able to crowdsource data. So it's actually, we can use the strength of the network. Here, Jenna Uka was served by 3 CBOs, but CBO A has an MPL ID. CBO B and C were not able to obtain MPL ID. But because we have one, I will automatically populate the missing data and submit it once. And if they match, we will return the MPL IDs to all 3 organizations. Here we can use it as a strength. But when it gets problematic is situations such as here. If it's within the CBO, a single CBO, I can still populate, but it would be nicer if we could just get only one of this record instead of the 2 missing ones. Again, this is a very simple situation. If date of birth, let's say the second entry had a typo, instead of June 19th, it's June 18th, we will automatically think this is a different student because we're not manually checking it. So as a simple problem can easily become very complicated very quickly when we're dealing with duplicates, because we don't know these students and we're looking at it from the data perspective. And then the last example is, again, within the same CBO, this is the same student, but for some reason, they have 2 different MPL IDs. This is possible. A student can have 2 MPL IDs. When they're participating in College Now or ECI, they're assigned a single MPL ID. And then when they matriculate to college, they have a different MPL ID. But what will help us is the second time, at some point, there should be some data on your end about which data is the latest. If that information could be provided, that would be helpful. And we are amending the roster template to include a new data point called last updated. So if that date could be provided, then we could just say, this is the latest data. So we'll keep that and run with that. But here we're not able to make a decision. So this causes us like a bit of decision paralysis. Which one should we keep? So we would treat them as 2 different students, and we would return back the one that's matched. And on your end, you will maybe assume that the student was never served. We need to think about a better way to communicate who's unmatched, who is the same student, and thinking about creating flags. So this is probably a longer conversation, but let's start from now. So for best practices, they're very simple recommendations. For first name and last name, which is one of the critical data points, it's maybe obtain their legal names, make sure that it's not their nickname or what their preferred name. Most often try to capture their legal name as it's on their DOE transcript or their CUNY application. It will make things a lot easier to match. Ensuring there's no typo, and making sure that the columns are correctly labeled. First name is first name and it hasn't been switched. And then for those who have data systems, just making sure you check if the systems exist. But if people are using Excel, you could use the Excel filter feature to just check if these students exist. If they do, you could, for example, look up a student, and if they already exist, then you could try to update the same record instead of creating a new one. For dates, first, good news, date of birth information are starting to be populated for most students, so it's no longer a key issue. We're getting date of births for most students. I think there's about 2 to 3% missingness, and that's not that terrible. What can be improved is formatting and making sure no other characters or notes are included, and just double check that it's formatted in the right way. So, in many cases, you probably have your own systems, so you're copy pasting the data into the roster. But once you copy paste, just make sure that you check if the birth date formatting is still short date. So it just helps. And here is a very simple example of when an additional character gets placed, and it really does affect how we process that single column. So data structure is one of my final recommendations. It's about how you keep information on your end. So as I mentioned, I told you to check if a student already exists and try to update the same record. That's one strategy. The other strategy is you could capture every transaction of the student, but have some kind of flag that identifies at which date they were served or which date that data got updated. It will help us keep the record that's the latest record. So an ask for all of you is, it would be great if only one record of the student is submitted in the roster. If you're including all records of a student, then provide, when it was updated. So we will start providing this column in the roster, last updated, and you could paste all of the dates. Here, going back to that same example of CBOD serving Mamadou Diallo, we can go through these dates and we will say, if they all have the same date of birth, I will keep the latest record of the student and I'll only submit this for the match, for example. While all of these very, very simple suggestions will just make it easier for us to clean the data, we also have more information so we can deal with the duplicates, and it'll also increase the probability of matching. And it'll be a lot of time in this entire process is really spent on data cleaning. So if we could decrease that, that means that we can easily turn around the match faster and get you the data earlier, so you could, so it's more helpful. So unmatched records, this is the biggest question of the day, which is, what do we do with unmatched? First of all, if a student is unmatched, I would recommend that you flag them on your end that they were unmatched and keep track of it. If new data is available, I highly recommend you resubmit, because if there's no new data available and you're simply submitting the same things, the first step of a match is to get an MPL ID. If they don't have an MPL ID, that means we're still not able to, we won't be able to pull anything from CUNY first. So it's not going to change the matching unless new information is available. So recommendations, flag the unmatched records on your end, track them to see if there's any new data. And then if there's new data, please resubmit them. So just very quickly, key takeaways: submit only one record for every student. Check if they exist, consolidate information. For example, if one has date of birth available and the other doesn't, try to put them in one record, or try to provide us with the latest update information so we can do it on our end. We have that information. First name, last name, and date of birth is required. Additional information can strengthen the match, but also help us deal with duplicates. And don't resubmit unmatched records again unless new data is available. That's kind of just the gist of this entire presentation. Yep, that's all. I will open it up. I'm happy to answer any questions.
So Barunda, just a few questions from the sheet that have already come up. One of them is, how do you suggest organizations handle a situation where a student may have applied to CUNY with the wrong legal name? That feels, not sure about.
If they applied with if the CUNY application data doesn't have the legal name, that should not be the issue. If they applied with the wrong name, that's okay, because that's what's going to be in the data system, unless it got rectified. And typically it gets corrected when students are expected to submit some form of ID or the supporting documents. So that's what I would say. I think if they applied with, like our example, Alex instead of Alexa, we should be able to match them.
Are middle names or initials taken into consideration, or double last names? I know we have a lot of students that.
They are. We remove the hyphen and we match it. And for example, sometimes the middle name gets tacked on with the last name, and sometimes it gets tacked on with the first name. We account for all of that.
And the last one I think from here is, how do we account for students who change their address? I think all addresses a student has submitted to CUNY are captured in the system, right?
Yes, all of them are, but we run it against the latest data. So if a student changed addresses, let's say between last semester and this semester, and we're trying to identify if a student is in the system, we capture all. But I think CUNY First is a live system. So it doesn't have all of the records. It has the latest record. But so where it gets captured, for example, if a student changed addresses 3 times, it gets captured in a different system called IRDB, which contains the frozen files. But we're trying to tap into the live system, and EMPL ID is a unique ID for the live CUNY1st system. So the latest address is going to be more helpful than an address a couple years ago. And that's what I mentioned about the OSIS. When we look up DOE records for a student who might have graduated 5 years ago, I'm not sure if the address that was placed in the high school system is still applicable. But we're trying to say, well, there's no address. I'd rather just try with this than send an empty data point. The second part of that question is, what do we do if there are multiple addresses? I would say add that as a new record, but also update the date. So you say, okay, new address was updated as of February 1st, 2021. That way I know that that's the latest record for the student. And I will try to match that instead of something that was from last year.
So what Barunda is referencing as well is we're going to add a column to the spring 2021 roster where you can put down the last time you updated that student record, just so that gives us a little bit more information. We have Barunda for about 5 more minutes. If anybody wants to take yourself off mute and ask her a question, she is the data guru.
It could be also clarification. I do know sometimes it's a bit like when I'm talking through it, I might sound very technical. So if you want me to like repeat, or if there was a part that was not clear, I can clarify that too.
Hi, my name is Camila. Thank you so much for this presentation. This information was super helpful. One clarifying question that I do have is, when you say resubmit, is this, like, for example, if I submit a student for spring 2020 and then I submit again for spring 2021 because I didn't receive grades? Is that what you mean by resubmitting?
No. Not receiving grades means you know they were enrolled in CUNY and just outcomes were not tracked. So I think that would be resubmitted to Latika and Rebecca just so they can pull it again. What I mean on resubmitting is if I said out of 100 students submitted, only 50 were matched to a valid EMPL ID. So what about the other 50 who don't have an EMPL ID to even tap into the CUNY1st system? If among those 50 students, you found out that 25 now have new email addresses, then I would recommend you submit those 25 again.
Thank you.
Are there any additional questions?
One question I had is that you mentioned that you have like a reconciliation process for like duplicate entries. And I was wondering, is that like just kind of within like a single submission, or are you looking at like what we submitted like last semester and what we submitted this semester and then trying to like reconcile from there?
It's every single submission. So a lot of these tables that I've pulled and scraped the CBO names are actual data points. This was from last fall. I've just removed the CBO and counselor name.
Okay, cool, thanks.
I think the first thing we do is you say, okay, we don't know if these are unique students, but what are the 3 things that can tell us who's a unique student? We use first name, last name, and date of birth to say how many similar records exist within a single CBO. And in some cases, we have up to 3 or 4 in a single CBO. And up to 7 across 3 CBOs. So the student appeared 7 times, but they were served by 3 different CBOs. So these are actual data points. So it's not, we're not looking historically.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately, right now we don't have the ability to kind of collect that historical information because we don't have a central database, but that's something that we are trying to build out. And that's kind of the second question on the Google Doc, is trying to collect information so we could pitch to a funder to build this out a little bit more.
we often, only add new students to our rosters, and because usually it's like the same roster, and then we add additional students for that semester. And so at any point should we go back in and refresh that initial roster, or do those stay matched? So yeah, I'm just asking a question about that, because I know that at every semester we've been kind of adding the newer students who have enrolled that semester, but usually the older students stay matched. I was trying to say if there's any point that we renew the entire roster.
To clarify, after the students are matched, then between Rebecca and myself, we code them into CUNY First. Once your students are coded, you do not have to resubmit them. They live there coded for your organization moving forward. And so that's where the reports get pulled from the students who are coded. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry. Sorry if it was obvious.
We can look at like a mock of the report if you want, but I have highlighted for you all the students that were coded this round. So you have that information and you can keep track of that on your end in a database if you'd like.